Hello students, today I'm going to show you how to find the chords and chord progression for those songs that you're working on piano. So let's not waste any time and let's get right on to the lesson. Okay, part one is figuring out the chords. Before you can begin analyzing a piece for its chords, you really need to become familiar with triads and seventh chords, both on the piano and sheet music. If you don't know your triads and seventh chords, you can actually look them up. What I would look up online is something called Chord Speller, and that'll tell you how they're spelled. Let me show you what you need to know. And the better you know your chords, the better off you'll be. And you'll see what I mean here in just a second. Okay, you need to know your triads, which are the three-note chords, and you need to know how they're spelled, meaning the three notes that make up that chord off the top of your head. Like I said, you can look it up if you don't know, but what I mean is you really need to know that, like, say, E major, E, G sharp, B. I knew how to play it, I knew what it looked like, and I knew the three notes E, G sharp, B that it is made up of. B flat major, B flat, D, F. I know right away. How about F minor, F, A flat, C? What about C diminished, C, E flat, G flat? So the types of triads you need to become familiar with are major, minor, diminished, and augmented. If you don't know about any of those, you can take a look at the description to learn more. Seventh chords have four notes to them. It doesn't have seven like you would think the name would suggest. The name seventh chord comes from the distance between the bottom and top note when it's in root position. So you need to become familiar with the different types of seventh chords, like major seventh, dominant seventh, minor seventh, half diminished seventh, and fully diminished seventh. Now, there are some chords you should be aware of beyond that, like ninth chords, but basically, if you know how your triads and you know your seventh chords, you can use this method to figure out the chords and progression pretty easily. Let's move on to step 2 of the method. Okay, figuring out chords part 2. This is a very important thing to mention. Chords are often split up between each clef. You're not going to see triads just stacked very neatly on top of one another. You will see that, but mainly you're going to be seeing things more like this, where it's split up between the two hands. You don't have just, a C major chord just like that. So basically, actually, I think it would do a little better to show you the whole thing. So this is the thing we need. So if you take a look, we don't have a, block triad chord all at once. We have the notes being played separately between both of the hands in this example. If you're wondering what this example is, it's from the Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1, and this is the Prelude in C major by J.S. Bach. And that's the first measure, right? So we have to figure out what chord is happening in this measure, even though it's not being played all at once. One thing you can do is, instead of playing all the notes, separately like they want, to just play them all at once and see what happens. Now, there's some things you need to look out for, which we'll talk about in the next step. But taking a look here, right, I see that we have 5 notes here. So this isn't some sort of 7th chord or 9th chord or anything like that. This is a simple triad, believe it or not. You may be saying, well, how can it have 5 notes and be a triad? Well, a triad has 3 unique notes in it. It doesn't have, so if some of them are repeated, they don't count again. We have C, E, G, and then C, E. Well, I already have C and E down here, so I don't really need them again up here. So I just play the chord as we have it, C, E, and G. Well, hey, that's a C major triad. That's one of the first triads you need to learn. And so you can surmise that in this measure, we're outlining a C major chord. One thing I recommend you do when you're starting to analyze sheet music like this is write the name of the chord underneath the measure. I have the pen a little bit too thick there. It looks a little bit weird, but you want to be writing the names of the chord underneath each measure until you get used to it, until you're able to pick out these chords very easily. Okay, taking a look here at measure 2. Okay, so taking a look at measure 2, now we have the notes C, D, and then A, D, F. You play them all at once, and you're like, well, it's pretty hard to figure out exactly what chord this is. This is where it comes in, where if you know your chords really well, your seventh chord, your triads off the top of your head, say D minor seventh, made up of the notes D, F, A, and C. This is where this comes in, because you play it and you're like, okay, I have these notes. I have a C, a D, A, D, F. And it's like, well, hey, it's in a different order, but I still have the same notes as that D minor seventh chord I just listed. So the chord in this measure is a D minor seventh. Again, if you don't know your chords off the top of your head, go on to Google and look up something called a chord finder, or just some kind of listing of the chord speller. What I meant to say, and how they are spelled, and the notes that make them up. So knowing your chords off the top of your head is super, super duper helpful when doing this. So for instance, say I had a measure where I had F, A, and then, I don't know, like E, F, A. Well, begin to know my chords right away. I know that that's an F major chord. One thing that I briefly touched on before is that it doesn't matter the order in which the notes appear in. So a C major chord is made up of the notes C, E, and G. Well, what if I have E, G, and C? Well, it doesn't matter. It's still the same three notes. You're not going to have another chord most of the time that has the same notes as another chord. Sometimes it can get a little iffy, but for now, that holds true for what we're talking about today. Okay, figuring out the chords, part 3. Sometimes melody notes will have notes that do not belong to the chord. These are known as non-chord tones. This is just what I was talking about, how not all the time when you play all the notes together will it work out so well. So let me show you exactly what I mean. Okay, this is prelude number 2 from the Well-Tempered Clavier. This one is in C minor. So if we take a look at the notes that make up this measure, I have a C. Let me move this back a little bit. You have C, I have an E flat here. Down below I have a C and a G. So far let's play what we have. And because I know how my chords are spelled, I know that that's a C minor chord. It's a little confusing. What you may need to do sometimes, let me show you here, is you may need to move up the left-hand notes up an octave, and then drop out any of the duplicated notes, play all those notes together, and it's a lot easier to pick up the chord like that, because it's like, oh, well, that's a C minor. I can see it, right there. However, if you read a little further into the measure, we have a D here, which is odd, a D, and an F. And you may be thinking, well, that complicates it, doesn't it? Because if I have this and I put a D and F in there, well, that's not a chord at all, and it just sounds awful. Well, guess what? There are these things in music called non-chord tones, where they are notes that are temporarily in there that do not belong to the chord of that measure. Now, it's a whole other lesson in itself to identify all the different types of non-chord tones. So what I can tell you right now is just take the first beat or the downbeat of the measure, so the very first notes that are introduced, and line them up vertically, see if they make a chord. And this first, that's just C and C, so that doesn't really work out. But then I will put those together. That's a C minor triad. You notice how the D here, the non-chord tone, also called NCTs, by the way, you notice how they're temporary, right? You go from that D in your, same thing with the F in the left hand, but you go from the D right back to a chord tone, which is that E flat. So therefore, when identifying the chord, you need to forget about the non-chord tones. This may seem really confusing at first. My suggestion to you is try to find some pieces without many non-chord tones, to where you can just analyze the notes going on and try to fit them to a chord. And just, you can identify non-chord tones because they are temporary. You're not going to see a lot of non-chord tones right away, right in a row. You're going to see one of them, and then it's going to go right back to a chord tone again. That's just one of the rules of music, is that you want to avoid using too many non-chord tones right in a row. So you have to be careful with those, not to be confused with that. I know it's confusing in the beginning, but look up, before we make the next lesson, I'm going to make a lesson on non-chord tones, but look up basically how non-chord tones are constructed. Okay, let's take a look at this next measure as an example. I have the notes C and A flat here. They're the first notes of the measure between the two hands. And if I take a look, that doesn't really make a chord yet because I only have a C and an A flat. Let's see what the next notes are and play them all together, all four of those first notes. So these are the notes I'm talking about. Those four. And hey, you know what? The A flat's doubled, so I don't really need that anymore. Let's move the C up here, play it all at once. We have the notes F, A flat, and C. Like I said, you can look it up to see what it is, or if you know your chords real well. That's an F minor triad. However, let's take a look a little bit further. Now we have an E natural and a G. Well, hey, that messes everything up, doesn't it? Because if I have F, A flat, C, G, and E, well, that sounds downright awful. So we're probably dealing with some non-chord tones here. Remember, non-chord tones are temporary, meaning that the notes before and after them will belong to the chord. Let's check to see if that's true. So here's the note after, F and A flat. Hey, that belonged into the chord. So therefore, those the E and the G are non-chord tones. You need to ignore them when doing your chord analysis. So you're just going to write F minor here. F minor in my huge, thick handwriting there. So there we go. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit how to figure out the key. This is really important in determining the key signature. So really, again, if you know your key signatures really well, this is really helpful. You can use something called the circle of fifths. I have a lesson on that as well. And it's really a visual tool on how to figure out your key signatures. So let me show you what I mean. Okay, taking a look at the piece we had once again, same piece as before, the C minor prelude here. We have three flats, B, E, and A. Now, like I said, you can go on the internet, look that up, look up the circle of fifths, find it on the chart, figure it out for that. But that's not the lesson today. Or you can say in your mind, okay, I remember that the major key with three flats is E flat. But remember that for each key, there's a major and minor equivalent. So once you figure out the key, you also have to figure out whether it's the major or minor. So it could be E flat major or C minor. One of the things I suggest you do, that'll give you a hint, is play the first chord of the piece. What we talked about a minute ago was a C minor chord. We had those non-chord tones in there, but we're going to ignore those. So C minor. Well, hey, that fits the minor key progression, or chord progression not chord progression, key signature I was talking about a second ago. So chances are we're in the key of C minor. There's another way to check. So you look at the key signature, you look at the first chord, and you look at the last chord. Let's take a look and see what it says. Okay, here's the very last chord of the piece. And they wrote it like a normal chord for us, so that's very nice. Okay, so I have the notes C, E, and G. Well, hey, wait a second. They made that E a natural. That's a C major chord. However, I want to let you know that sometimes if you're in a minor key, like C minor, you can actually end on a major version of that same chord. So instead of a C minor chord, they'll end on a C major. Bach does that quite often. That's what we call a Picardy third. But still, the root of the chord is C. So you have C, and C matches up with C minor. So most likely we're in the key of C minor. Learning what key you're in is really important in determining the next step, which is the chord progression of the song, which I'm going to show you how that applies right now. Okay, so here's where the meat of the lesson is, figuring out the chord progression. That's what we've done all the work up until now to figure out. Well, chord progressions are written as a number system, often in Roman numerals. As you may have read, like online, you see chord progressions written as I, V, IV, and then I. Well, if you know your Roman numerals, that's 1, 4, 5, and then 1. I'm not sure if that's the order I actually said the numbers in or not, but they're often expressed as Roman numerals. What's that about? What are those numbers, and what in the world do they mean? Well, let me show you here. Okay, so say we have the C major scale just to make things easy. We have 8 notes in that scale, right? And you can also build a chord on each one of those notes. Therefore, we have 8 chords in a scale. We really only have 7 individual chords. So really, once you get back up to chord number 8 here at the very end, we don't really have a chord 8. They just call that 1 again. And it makes sense since it's the same exact chord. So that's where the Roman numeral numbers come in handy, or basically where they come from is because if say you're in C major and it says an I, which is 1. Well, they're talking about C major chord, a note built on the first note of the scale. What if they have 4? Well, in C major, you go 1, 2, 3, 4. You build a major chord on that, and hey, that is your 4 chord. You have your 5 chord after that, 6 chord, 7 chord, 8 chord. So that's where the numbers come in. And that's also why it's important to know what key you're in, because depending on what key you're in, it determines the scale you'll be using to base your chords off of. So say we're in A major, right? Keep in mind that we have 3 sharps, F, C, and G. The chords will be different because obviously now we're starting on A. A will now be our first chord. B minor will now be our second chord, going up to the 3rd note. C sharp minor will be our 3rd chord, D major, 4th chord. So depending on what scale you're in, tells you what the chords will be for that scale. So that's why it's important to determine your key, because say we're in C minor like we were a second ago, and it said we determined that the chord was a 1 chord. Well, that's going to be a C minor. Well, what if it's a 5 chord? Well, that's going to be a G minor. I think you get the idea by now. Let's look at an example together. Okay, back to prelude number 1. In what key are we in? Well, there's nothing written here, right? There's no key signature written at all. I mean, there's a time signature written there, the C there, but there's actually no key signature, no sharps or flats. Therefore, we're either in the key of C major or A minor. What key? I actually told you in the beginning of the lesson what key we were in, but what key are we in? Let's do tip number 1, right? You look at the first chord of the piece, and if you remember, I said C major, and then you check the last chord of the piece, see if it matches, and it does, and that's C major. So we're in the key of C major. So therefore, when I'm playing this first chord here, it's a C major chord. What number chord is that gonna be in the C major scale? Well, hey, that's the first note, first chord of the scale. So what you want to do underneath the chord, or underneath the measure, is write the Roman numeral of the chord you're talking about. There's 1. That's the first element in our chord progression, or the first chord. You go on to, it looks like we have the same chord all through that measure. You can change chords in the middle of a measure, but in this piece they do not, which is one of the reasons I chose it. It simplifies it a little bit. And hey, here, let's take a look here. And then earlier, remember, we determined that that was a D minor chord. And hey, what number is D minor in relation to C? Well, it's the second chord, right? You just go up 1 from C, and you got D minor. Therefore, that's a 2. Now, one thing I wanted to tell you is that if the chord is minor, the Roman numeral will also be undercase. Uppercase is for major chords, lowercase for minor. So you're actually going to write a 2, but it's going to be I, lowercase I. Okay, taking a look at this measure, I'm going to play all those notes together and take a look at the notes I have. I have a G, a B, a D, and an F. And like I said, you can look up that chord online if you need. But because I know my chords so well, that's a G dominant 7th, also just written as 7. I know it's going to get a little confusing here, but let's just stick to the Roman numerals for now. So let's just say we have a G chord, right? Now your question is, what number of the C major scale is G? Well, you just go 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 5th note of the C major scale. So we're going to write in uppercase 5 because it's a major chord. Okay, let's take a look at this measure. Oops. Oh, hey, that's just the first chord we had again. So we're going to write 1. Or an I, uppercase I. Take a look at this one. Oh, hey, I have A, C, E. I play it as a triad, and that's an A minor triad. Remember that if the chord is a minor chord, the Roman numeral is going to be undercase. So since we have an A minor chord, you need to ask yourself one question. What note of the C major scale is A? Well, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until you get to A. And you're, oh, hey, that's A6, but I'm going to write it in a lowercase 6 and not an uppercase. Okay, so just taking a look at the first two lines here, I'm not going to do the entire piece because that would take too long. There's also some other things with borrowed chords and secondary dominants that I'm not going to explode your brain over today. So we're just going to do the first two measures here, or the two lines here. We have a 1 chord, followed by a 2 chord, by a 5 chord, back to a 1 chord, and then 6. And then when you put these, from beginning to end, that is your chord progression. That's your progression of chords throughout the song. So this is how you figure out both the chords, the chords, the key, and the chord progression. So hopefully by the end of the lesson, you at least have some idea on how to put this together. You're not going to be a master at this overnight. It is definitely going to take some time to get the hang of. So if you're confused at first, do not worry. What I recommend, though, is taking a look at some easy sheet music. So say Jingle Bells or something like that, and try to figure out the chords to it. First determine what key you're in, and then take a look at, the chords that are throughout, and then try to match those chords with the number of the scale. Number of the note of the scale it is. So if you're in the key of D, and you have an A chord, you have to say, all right, well, what number of the D major scale is A? Now, if you don't know about your chords, your progressions, or your chords, your major, minor chords, triads, and everything like that, and you don't know about your key signatures and a lot of the other things that may have caused you confusion in this lesson, I do have playlists on the channel. I'm going to provide links to those playlists in the description of this video. So once you're finished this video, go back and watch those to brush up on the knowledge. And then if you need to, come back to this video and watch it again, and it will make more sense to you. Like I said, this is not something that will come to you all at once. It's something that you need to practice every day. Okay, now I'm going to answer your questions about figuring out the chords with the students that are here in the live stream today. So let's take a look at our questions. So I have quite a few questions here on why are some of the chords written in lowercase Roman numerals. So remember, if it's written in lowercase, we're talking about minor triads. If it's uppercase, we're talking about major triads. If it has a 7 or a 9, you're talking about 7th chords or 9th chords. We're not going to dive real deep into that today. So like I said, I just want to introduce you to this topic. I don't want to get you way confused. All right, Ryan, thank you again for another great super chat, Ryan, and coming out once again. Okay, Tim, got to head out in a few. Thanks, and talk soon. You're very welcome, Ryan, and don't let the confusion get to you. This is something, like I said, you'll learn with time. All right, everybody, let's see here. Welcome, Sam G, by the way, who said, kindly show the instrument since you're a beginner. I'll keep that in mind to show that as much as possible. You're always welcome to come back and join us for these live streams anytime. Somebody asked if I can review key signatures. Again, let me point you in the right direction, though, Fuddy Duddy, first, because this lesson can really help you out. So let me get it up here. So hold on. Let me get the old YouTubes up and running here. So youtube.com, oh hey, that's us right now. You want to type in circle of fifths, and I think my lesson will come up right away since I think it's ranking pretty high for that. So third one down, it looks like. You can see my face on it. It's called How to Master Key Signatures and the Circle of Fifths. in one easy lesson. You really want to check this out. A lot of people really like this lesson, and because it describes on how to figure out key signatures very, very well. But let me give you like an introductory lesson into key signatures. First, let me look up something called the circle of fifths. Okay, so key signatures are these things written on the outside of the circle. As you can see, hopefully you can see, oops. Hopefully you can see around on the outside of the circle, those are the key signatures. You've probably seen those before in the songs you play. The circle of fifths is a visual tool that you can look at to figure out what key you're in. So take a look here. We have the top one. Notice underneath it says keys C major and then A minor, and then if you go to the right, there's one with one sharp, right? Well, if you go to the outside, the next circle in from the outside, you notice in orange it says G, right? G major. So that's the key of G major, that one with one sharp right there. So when you're playing the G major scale, that sharp has to be F, by the way. It happens to be F. You're playing the G major scale, like so. You have to make sure that you have an F sharp in there. So a key, to sum it up, tells you what notes are sharp or flat throughout an entire song. So the key of D, let's take a look back at the circle of fifths. The key of D has two sharps over here. This is just the next one over. You see that says D major there. So when you play the D major scale, you have to make sure that you have those two sharps in there. Oh, let me show you. Just like that. So that's part of the key signature, is having those two sharps. And like I said, the circle of fifths, if you don't have these memorized yet, these keys, I'm going to have a lesson on that pretty soon, by the way, on how to memorize these. But if you don't have them memorized, you can use this visual tool, again called the circle of fifths, to figure out what key you're in, because every song has a key signature. If it doesn't have anything written, you're talking about C major or possibly A minor. Okay, so hopefully that sums it up a bit. But check out that circle of fifths video. You'll find it really helpful for your keys. All right, anybody else have a question? Oh, Rich says, sorry, I skipped your question here. Is the fingering the same for all types of seventh chords? Well, let me take a look. Actually, interesting thing is that's kind of what we're going to be talking about next time a little bit. We're going to dive into that a bit. Let me make sure I'm right on this. I believe the answer is yes. So the fingering is the same for all types of seventh chords, whether you have major, minor, or major, minor, dominant, or half diminished or fully diminished. The fingering for right hand is always 1, 2, 3, 5, and for left hand it's 1, 3, 2, or 5, 3, 2, 1. Now when you invert it, it's a little different, I think. Yeah, so first inversion would be 1, 2, 4, 5. Second inversion is 1, 2, 3, 5. It's really what makes the most sense, because say I have a third inversion of this C major seventh chord. Well, since I have these two notes right here, it would make sense to use fingers 1 and 2 there. I have a little bit of gap, so I can use 3 and then 5. So you use what makes sense to you, but the answer is yes, that all seventh chords will have, no matter what type they are, will have the same fingering. But the inversions are different. But the inversions are also the same between the chords. All right, everybody, if you want to learn more about the topics we talked about, and I know in this lesson I said a lot, like, oh, if you have your chords mastered, it really helps. If you have your key signatures mastered, it really helps. If you have your, if you know about chord progressions, it really helps. Well, how are you going to learn more about this stuff? Well, you check out these playlists I have here for you. They're going to be posted here as annotations. You can also check them out in the description. I highly recommend you look at those once you finish this lesson, and then if you need to, come back to this lesson to tie everything together. So thanks everybody for coming out today. Have a great one, and I'll talk to you in the next lesson. Thank you so much.